Mina sat me at the kitchen table on Christmas while her parents toasted in my living room. On New Year's Eve, I sold the house out from under them. Nana, why don't you go sit at the kitchen table and do your little Christmas thing or whatever? We've got guests to entertain. That is what Charlie said to me. She said it without even turning her head. Her hands were full, balancing 2 wine glasses and a stack of gold-foiled napkins. But her voice sliced through the holiday hum like a cold wind slipping under a door. It was not what she said. It was the way she said it, dismissive, rehearsed, the same tone one might use to tell a dog to get off the furniture. And just like that, my role was clear. It did not matter that this house used to be mine, or that every molding, every paneled wall and archway still echoed with the fingerprints of my life. It did not matter that the dining room they had closed off for VIP family only still bore the scent of cinnamon pine cones I used to set out each December, or that the garland winding down the banister had been hand-twisted by my late husband the year before his stroke. None of that mattered anymore. They had decided that I no longer fit the picture. So I walked toward the kitchen, clutching the folds of my red wool coat tighter around me. The same coat Henry gave me on our last Christmas together. The same coat Charlie had called a fashion tragedy when she unpacked my boxes 2 months ago. The kitchen had no centerpiece, no garland, no music, just a dim bulb overhead, a scratched linoleum floor, and the ticking of a wall clock that sounded far too loud. I sat at the old oak table, my table, mind you, the one I had served 23 Thanksgivings on, and listened to the laughter spilling out from the living room. Clinking glasses, claps on shoulders, and soft jazz echoing under the chandelier I had personally dusted every year since 1976. Part of me wanted to cry, the part that still believed Christmas was sacred, the part that remembered when family was something more than display. But I did not cry. I straightened my back, folded my hands, and stared ahead at the stovetop where nothing was cooking. Because silence, I have learned, is not weakness. It is where memory waits for the world to catch up. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. From the kitchen, I could see Charlie's mother sipping from a crystal flute, wearing the velvet scarf I gave her 2 Christmases ago. Regifted, apparently, and now part of her holiday glam. Jamie was leaning against the fireplace mantel, like he had built it himself, laughing too loud at a story his father-in-law was telling about real estate in Savannah. And my granddaughter, Lily, was on the couch with Charlie's niece, their legs curled under faux fur throws, heads pressed together like sisters. No one looked toward the kitchen. No one wondered if I needed a refill, a plate, or a seat with company. I had become something less than background noise. I had become furniture. Stationary, silent. Last year, they invited me to read the Nativity passage. This year, they gave me paper plates and a folding chair. Keep Nana in the kitchen, Charlie had said earlier in the week, thinking I could not hear. She'll feel important, like she's helping. But I was not helping. I was being shelved. When I had arrived that morning, I brought a tin of sugar cookies, my husband's favorite. I spent 3 hours on them, rolled each one by hand, pressed the edges with a fork the way my mother taught me. When Charlie opened the tin, she looked at them the way a model might look at a cheap sweater. "These are cute," she said, "but we have caterers. Maybe put them in the back, so they don't confuse the display." So I did. I put them in the back. I watched her dump them into a Tupperware and shove them beneath the counter. Not even into the fridge. I wish I could say that was the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was watching my own son nod along. Jamie used to stand on a stool to help me stir those same cookies. When he was 7, he cried because the dog ate the last batch. When he was 12, he made me promise I'd show his wife how to bake them, just like Nana. Now he stood 3 feet away from me, praising the rosemary cracker crisps the caterer brought in silver trays. The room smelled of white wine and expensive perfume. My coat smelled of cedar and mothballs. I shifted in my chair, the cushion thin from years of use, and realized they did not hate me. That would have taken effort. No, they had simply decided I was no longer necessary. There was a time I might have stayed quiet, a time when my pride would have told me to smile through it, wait for the next morning, and pray they came around. But something in me was stirring now. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was that damn coat, the last thing Henry ever gave me, and the only thing in that house no one dared to throw out. But I felt it. That quiet, sacred kind of rage, not the kind that burns, the kind that builds. I leaned back in the chair, looked around that lonely kitchen, and made myself a promise. They would remember this Christmas. Not for the champagne, not for the catered fig tartlets, not for Charlie's Instagram worthy with wreaths. They would remember it because this was the last time they would seat me in the shadows and expect me to disappear. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would simply rise. And next Christmas, if they were lucky, they would find out just how loud a woman can be when she has spent a lifetime being silenced. They say memory is a kindness, but sometimes it is a curse, especially when you remember every gift you gave that was punched back at your face. I remember telling Jamie when he was in his 20s, his business sputtering and no one giving him the time of day, that profit is not where worth lies. I shared with him old lessons from the years I held books open for him. How stocking the pantry, balancing accounts, we never called that work. But one afternoon, when he was fraying at the edges and Charlie had just emptied the kitchen cookie jar, he snorted and said, "Nana, you're sweet, but you're so out of touch with how business works now. You don't get scale or brand, so out of touch, as if decades of support had rendered me obsolete. Nana, you're sweet, but you're so out of touch with how business works now. You don't get scale or brand, so out of touch, as if decades of support had rendered me obsolete. And I was told, now that we can afford a nanny, you're irrelevant." That word echoed in me long after she spoke it. Jamie once proposed that I sell my little patch of garden behind the house to pay off his credit card. He said it was practical. That land isn't worth much anymore anyway. I told him it was worth more than money. That was where Henry and I planted our apple tree, where our children ate their first strawberries, where our wedding guests tossed confetti. I said, "I cannot sell it." And he turned on me, his face bright with frustration. "That tree? Those sweet memories? They killed the chances I had for a future," he said. And I, who had believed in him, felt my bones crack at that. Then came the day Charlie cracked that wedding photo frame against the wall. Shards of glass scattered across my cherished crochet doily. She said the frame was garish, outdated, a relic of a past she was done with. "It does not match our foyer," she said, arms crossed, tilting her head. The crystal tears I never shed glistened on the photo of me and Henry, so alive then, so erased now. There were other times they dismissed me in more biting ways. At brunch with friends one Sunday, I wore the shawl that Henry had knitted decades ago, emerald and gold, and someone commented how it looked like a stain on their carefully curated holiday, and Charlie muttered in my ear, "You're a blot on this narrative." I nodded. I bowed. I learned that you could be dressed in tradition and still be thrown out like yesterday's news. And yet through all that, I kept the facade of being helpful, being quiet, being patient. I cooked meals, tidied beer bottles from Jamie's college friends when they crashed on the couch, even mended socks for Lily before tossing them in the laundry. I thought love worked in cycles. You give again. You give until you are hollow, and they come back around. But that's not how love works, nor memory. Then, on that cold Christmas night, Charlie stood over my bent shoulders in the kitchen and sniffed the air. "That smell, your homemade cinnamon rolls. I swear it ruins my Christmas vibe," she said, loud enough that the laughter in the living room froze. "I cannot stand that smell, Nana. It's too real." And I leaned into that judgment, let it target me, a woman who spent decades creating warmth, told she smelled like reality. A scent spoiled the gloss of holiday fantasy. My heart thudded so loud I could hear it. I raised my chin, trying to anchor myself in that moment. Tonight I felt something else. Fire. Not to burn, though I could have, but to rekindle. These are the memories I carry with me, the looks, the words, the moments of being deemed not enough to warrant a seat at their dinner table. They thought those were harmless. They thought they were invisible punishments. But I remembered, and that is my edge. Truth is, one does not break someone who still remembers who they were, who still loves what once was. So as the murmur of celebration drifted through the closed door, I sat there in the kitchen, Still calm, still composed, but not silent. My mind was mapping the way they would learn what it means to forget someone who was never meant to vanish. Because the second act of a life lived with dignity does not start with revenge, it starts with presence. And trust me, presence can be far louder than any holiday toast. They thought I had no idea what Jamie was doing when he started that artificial intelligence company. Back then, he used to sit across from me at the dining room table, shuffling through notebooks, tossing out acronyms I had never heard of. Machine learning, predictive modeling, neural mapping. He said them like passwords to a club I was too old to join. One night, I brought him tea and asked what he was working on. He laughed and said, "Nana, no offense, but you barely understand email. This stuff would fly straight past you." And I remember nodding as if that did not sting. But I was not offended. I was invested. Literally. Jamie never knew that the anonymous investor his business partner kept referring to in hushed tones, the early angel fund that saved their company from closing before it even launched, was me. Not directly, of course. I had set up a trust back in 2010 with the help of a quiet, brilliant attorney named Elijah. It was originally meant to protect the house, but over time, I added a separate arm of it, a small investment pool for community technology advancement. It was my money, my rules. When Jamie's startup looked like it might make something of itself, I took a leap. He thought the funding came from a distant friend of his co-founder's aunt. I let him think that. I let him laugh in my kitchen and say old people just do not get it, do they? What he did not know, and what Charlie certainly never bothered to ask, was that the company they were so proud of, the one Jamie boasted about to Charlie's father while I quietly cleared dishes from behind their champagne flutes, that company now had a valuation of nearly $24 million, 0 cents. And my trust, through the backdoor equity deal they signed in desperation 5 years ago, held just under 8%. Not bad for someone who did not get tech, but this was never about the money. It was about control and about memory, because while they turned me into an afterthought, I had kept perfect records. The trust that held the house had not just preserved the roof above their heads, it had protected me. No changes to title, no transfers of ownership, no refinancing. None of it was possible without my signed approval. And the best part? They had never once asked, because they assumed I was already legally out of the picture. Jamie had even bragged last spring, "Charlie's dad says we can remodel soon, might knock out the study for a wine room." And I smiled, knowing he could not swing a hammer until I said so. On December 29th, while they were away at some private spa for post-holiday detox, I met Elijah for lunch. He had aged gracefully, gray at the temples, kind eyes, steady hands. He brought the documents I needed, and I brought my notebook, the one they never touched, the one where I had been collecting phrases, dates, insults, decisions for over 3 years. "You are sure?" he asked me over coffee. "I am ready," I said, "and I want it public." He looked at me carefully. "Do you want to move out?" "No," I answered. "I want them too." The plan was simple. On New Year's Eve, the trust would list the house for public sale. I had legal authority. The house was mine. They had simply been tenants, entitled, noisy ones. By January 2nd, the listing would go live, but the real show? That would happen at midnight. On the 31st, while Charlie orchestrated her white and gold New Year's soiree, streamers and signature cocktails and selfie booths, I set my own plan in motion. Just after 11:00 p.m., I placed a small phone stand on the kitchen counter. I angled it perfectly to capture the hallway, the grand staircase, and just enough of the glittering chaos in the living room. Then I hit record, and I hit go live. The caption read, "When they forget whose house they are celebrating in." At first, a few viewers trickled in, then dozens, then hundreds. By the time the clock hit 11:47, nearly 5,000 people were watching. They watched as Jamie toasted his incredible year. They watched Charlie thank the universe for their home and success. They watched guests dance beside the mantel I built with Henry's hands, beneath the chandelier Charlie once called tacky, and then I stepped into frame. Not loudly, not angrily, just fully present, holding the signed sale agreement and the deed transfer notice. My voice was calm, but it carried. "Jamie," I said, "Charlie, can I have a moment?" They froze. The camera caught it all, the confused smiles, the quick exchange of looks, the sudden flush rising in Jamie's cheeks. "This house," I said, "has been sold." Charlie laughed, then scoffed. "To who?" "To someone who values memory," I said, "and who knows how to read a trust document." I held up the folder, and as the final seconds of the year ticked away behind them, as the countdown echoed from the television, 10, 9, 8, I watched the faces of my family shift. Not just with confusion, but with understanding. They had mistaken silence for surrender, and I was here to remind them, I may bake cookies, I may wear old wool coats, but I never forget what is mine. And now, neither would they. The countdown clock in the living room ticked down while guests clinked their crystal glasses, the brassy notes of champagne flutes filling the air, and the soft glow of golden lights casting warmth over the guest like a velvet embrace. Jamie stood in the center, a smug grin plastered across his face, his blazer shimmering just enough to catch the spotlight when he raised his phone for a selfie. Charlie draped a cream fur stole over her shoulders, hair perfectly coiffed, lips the color of winter berries, declaring, "Here's to our most perfect Christmas ever," as if she'd forgotten there had ever been a Nana, and certainly not one seated away with biscuits cooling on waxed paper. I stood up where I'd been quietly lingering by the kitchen doorway. My red coat, the one Henry picked out for me, felt heavy with intention, the linen lining cradling my heart. I pushed aside a cocktail dish, smoothing the edge of the doorway, and strode forward. I was camel-steady in my sensible heels, the familiar tick-tick-tick of the champagne-filled clock lost in my exhale. No one expected me in that moment. Like someone aimed to replace a spotlight with truth, I stepped into the golden ambiance. Champagne sparkles in tall glasses caught my eye for a heartbeat, and then I cleared my throat. "Merry New Year," I said, voice calm but clear, carrying every ounce of memory, love, and hurt. The house was sold this morning. The room froze. Jamie's phone slipped from his fingers, landing with a sharp clink on the marble bar. Charlie's hand flew to her mouth as another guest gasped. The band faltered mid-note on their jazz refrain. I didn't wave. I didn't apologize for interrupting. I let the silence do the work. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped forward from the shadows. Elijah, my attorney and old friend. He carried a manila folder embossed with gold. All eyes turned to him as he opened it and spoke in a voice soft but firm. "The trust document, executed in 2010, is legally binding. The house was transferred this morning at 9:05 to a charitable foundation benefiting children across Georgia. All signatures are verified." Gasps echoed. Champagne drenched the floor, half trickling onto the hem of Charlie's gown. Jamie staggered backward, knocking into his father-in-law, who swore softly in amazement. "This is insane," Jamie stuttered, fumbling for words. "But that house, our—" "Elijah," I said quietly, but loud enough now. How fast can the paperwork be reversed if they want to fight? He looked at me, then all of them. "Time is short. But remember, signatories in 2010 under your husband's last wishes override any claim without your concurrence, Mrs. Holloway." I offered his gaze a small nod. Charlie's breath hitched, and she pressed a trembling hand to her throat. She tried to salvage grace. "Mom, Nana," she began, voice cracking. But no one moved to comfort her. No warm arms reached out. People wanted to look, but not touch the moment. I should have been silent again. I should have walked away and pretended nothing had changed. But instead, something urged me to speak, not with anger, but with the cooling power of certainty. So I said it. This house, built with care, with holidays and homework and memories of our children learning to ride bikes, it is no longer mine, but it is no longer yours either. It belongs to those who need a home, not just a holiday backdrop. I turned my face to the crowd, shoulders squared. Old neighbors, a few kids with sugar mustaches from the dessert table, who looked up at me with wide eyes. As the clock ticked past midnight, they heard my words the way winter hears the first thaw. The room was stunned. Charlie's eyes filled. I could see the reflection of those golden lights in her pupils as they trembled. She looked at her father, who lay a protective hand on her shoulder, but caused her fur stole to fall slightly off. She looked at Jamie, who looked like a child who just broke a vase and was realizing the silence that followed was more painful than the smash. I walked back to the kitchen with Elijah beside me, each step soft but weighty. I passed the living room once more and allowed myself a small smile. They thought they were hosting the merriest party, the perfect New Year. Instead, it became the night they remembered, the voices they silenced. I took off that red coat and draped it over my chair. There would be no presents for me this year, but there was peace, and a story it would tell generations. And as I turned toward the quiet of the kitchen, I told myself softly, your silence was your armor, but now speaking has freed you. They thought I would disappear quietly, that once the glitter was swept from the floor and the scent of burned champagne drifted out the open windows, I would return to my knitting and forget I ever owned the walls they celebrated in. But what they did not anticipate was that the world had been watching. By New Year's Day morning, the video had gone viral. It was not planned, at least not entirely, but someone, one of Charlie's influencer friends, had clipped the moment I said, "The house was sold this morning," and posted it with the caption, "When Grandma flips the table," literally. It exploded. Within hours, major local outlets picked it up. One headline read, "Georgia grandmother turns tables on ungrateful family, donates home to orphans." Another, "She was treated like holiday clutter, now she owns the headlines." And then came the comments sections. People from every corner of the country flooded the story with words like, "You're my hero, I wish my grandma had fought back, and this is the kind of justice that makes the world feel right again." But not everyone was celebrating. Charlie lost 2 major real estate listings within 48 hours. One client, a politician's wife, sent a public statement. "If someone can treat her own family that way, I won't trust her with mine." Jamie's startup, meanwhile, was flagged for an internal audit. Someone online had pointed out that the mysterious original investor in the company had been left out of public documents, and regulators took notice. The silence from them was louder than their laughter ever was. On January 3rd, I was invited to speak on the Peach Talk Show, a local morning program that usually covered recipes, high school football, and community bake sales. But that week, they wanted me. The set was bright, too bright for my eyes, but I wore my red coat proudly, the same one Charlie once called visual noise. I looked straight into the camera and said the truth. I didn't sell the house out of bitterness. I sold it because I remembered who I was. The host asked gently, "Was it hard to do?" "No," I said. "What was hard was pretending I hadn't been erased in my own home. Selling it? That was simple." Then she asked, "Do you hope they'll apologize?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't need them to love me. I need them to respect me, and I need women like me to stop disappearing into the wallpaper of their children's success. I almost took my grandma to a nursing home today until I watched this. Tomorrow, I'm taking her to dinner instead." That segment aired at 9:00 a.m. By noon, over 12,000 people had commented. Some posted pictures of their own grandmothers. Others sent messages like, "You gave me the courage to say no, and because of you, I reclaimed my space at the table." But one stood out. It came from a woman in South Carolina. Her words were simple. "Thank you. You saved me from silence." I sat with that message for a long time. Longer than the interviews, longer than the applause. Because in all the noise, I knew what mattered was not the scandal, but the shift. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not just that I reclaimed a house, but that I reclaimed the right to be heard. They thought I would keep the house for myself, that I would sit in the sunroom counting days until someone remembered to visit. But I knew from the moment I signed the transfer that it would not be my home alone anymore. I renamed it Second Hearth. Not a shelter, not a retirement facility, but a home for women like me, women whose children stopped calling, women who once raised entire families but now ate dinner alone, in silence, with lights dimmed so the neighbors wouldn't see their loneliness. The renovations were subtle. I did not erase the past. I kept the wooden dining table Henry built, even though Jamie had tried to replace it with something more modern. I left the floral wallpaper Charlie said was embarrassingly country. I kept the creaky third stair and the copper tea kettle with a dent near the handle. Because history, unlike people, never abandons you when you age. By February, Second Hearth had welcomed its first residents. Clara, who had taught for 42 years before her daughter moved her into a back room temporarily, and Miss Eunice, who used to be a librarian, but now could not remember the last birthday card she received. They arrived with bags and disbelief, still carrying the weight of having been discarded. I greeted them not with pity but with warmth. "Your room is upstairs," I said, "and the window faces the garden. Henry always said morning light makes memories softer." Each woman who walked through that door brought with her a story, and I listened to every one, not just with my ears, but with the quiet part of my heart that had once felt invisible. And on the last Sunday of each month, we held our Christmas memory suppers. The table was dressed in red cloth, golden napkin rings, and plates that did not match but felt like home. Everyone brought a dish or a recipe, even if they had to whisper the ingredients from memory. The point wasn't perfection, it was presence. We lit candles for those who could no longer speak. We passed bread with hands that had once comforted crying children, hands that had sewn buttons and stirred gravy and buried husbands. And we told our stories. Some were short, like Clara's tale of the year her father gave her a scarf too long because he didn't know how to measure wool but tried anyway. Some were heavier. Eunice spoke of the Christmas she spent in silence because her son forgot she'd moved states. When it was my turn, I told them about the year Charlie told me I was a background prop in her holiday vision, and how I'd spent the rest of that night cleaning crumbs while they took pictures for Instagram. I told them that memory not to reopen the wound, but to stitch it closed alongside theirs. After that first supper, we made it a ritual, and I had a sign carved in warm oak hung just above the entryway. "There are no ghosts here, only memories worth honoring." Visitors began stopping by, nurses on break, college students looking for community service hours, even a few teenagers who just wanted to hear someone call them sweetheart. They sat with us at the table. They listened. They learned that aging is not the absence of worth, but the deepening of it. And for those of us who had once been pushed aside like seasonal decorations, this home became a second hearth, a place where we did not need to beg to be seen. We were the flame. In late March, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address, but I recognized the crooked loop in the J before I even opened it. It was from Jamie. It read, "I don't expect anything. I know I was wrong, but if there's any part of you that still loves me, Nana, I'd be grateful for just a piece of your Christmas bread, even a corner." There was no apology, not really, just hunger, and not for food. I sat with the letter for a full day. Then I baked, not a full loaf, not a fresh batch, just one single piece. From the freezer, the last from December's supper. I wrapped it in parchment, tied it with twine, and I added a note. "I do not ask you to forgive me," it said, "but I do hope you remember this feeling. May you never treat someone as disposable again, and may you never collapse when it's your turn to be left behind." I didn't sign it with love, but I signed it with my name. That was enough. The house was quiet that afternoon. Miss Eunice was napping, Clara was on the porch with a crossword, and a new resident, May, who was teaching herself how to crochet by watching videos on a borrowed phone. That's when the knock came. A group of students from the university had heard about Second Hearth. One of them, a soft-eyed girl named Eleni, asked if they could record our next supper. "We want to tell stories," she said, "but we want to listen first." I agreed. Not for the fame, not for the flurry of attention, but because I knew what it meant to be seen. And now I wanted others to see. That live stream went out to over 30,000 people. They watched as we passed plates, as we shared stories of grandmothers who died without visitors, of Christmases spent in shelters, of silent nights made not holy, but hollow. They watched women laugh through tears, tell jokes that creaked like old porch steps, and recite recipes as if they were spells passed down from kitchen witches long gone. They saw us, not as forgotten relics of a different time, but as archives of everything they'd one day want to remember. That night, before bed, I walked the halls of Second Hearth and touched each doorframe. Not to check, not to correct, just to bless. And I whispered to myself, "This is enough." I left the porch light on, not because anyone was coming, but because someone always might. And when they do, they will find us. Not with bitterness, but with stories. Because age is not a shame, it is an inheritance, and we are the keepers of its light. That December, snow came early. It dusted the windowsills of Second Hearth like powdered sugar, settling into every crease of brick and memory. I pulled out my red coat, yes, the same one they once said was too old, too loud, too out of place, and buttoned it up with steady hands. The lining was softer now, worn in all the right ways, like me. The house smelled of cinnamon and sage. Clara was shaping rolls in the kitchen, May was folding napkins into little hearts, and Eunice was teaching the newest guest, Ms. Lottie, how to wrap presents using recycled newspaper and ribbon from old birthday parties. Laughter laced through the halls, not loud but constant, like the kindling of a warm fire. Someone put Nat King Cole on the old record player, and I smiled. This was our Christmas. There was no tree so tall it touched the ceiling, no overpriced garlands, no photographers waiting to stage a perfect family moment. But the love here was real, and it needed no filter. At 6 o'clock, guests began to arrive. Some were neighbors, some were volunteers, some were grandchildren of residents long gone, but all of them called me the same thing now, Mama Marlene. It surprised me at first, the way that name clung to my heart like a child's hand, but over time I grew into it, not just as a title, but as a choice. Because a mama does not have to be the one who raised you. Sometimes she is the one who remained when everyone else forgot. We gathered in the dining room, 18 people that night, and we held hands before we ate. It was not a prayer, but a pause, a recognition of the long road behind us and the mercy of having made it this far. I looked at them, these women who had once been pushed into corners, these guests who now laughed without apology, and I felt something I had not felt in decades, home. And when someone asked, Mama Marlene, what does Christmas mean to you now? He answered without thinking. Christmas is not something you are given, I said softly. It is something you hold, with memory, with courage. I looked down at my hands folded neatly in my lap. They had baked, buried, stitched, wiped tears, carried groceries and turned keys in locks that no longer belonged to me. But tonight they rested, because they had built something no one could take away. Later, when the fire crackled low and the room quieted, someone asked if I ever thought of the family I had left behind. I said, sometimes, but not out of longing, out of learning. The past has its place, so do we, and as the clock crept toward midnight, I sat there in my red coat, surrounded by the hum of stories and soft smiles. There were no cold eyes watching me like I did not belong, no back rooms, no closed doors, just light, just warmth, just the kind of peace that arrives not when others make space for you, but when you claim it for yourself. And in that final hush, before the day turned, I whispered to no one and everyone. They once called it a little mess, a bit of holiday noise, something to sweep aside. Then I looked around at the candles flickering, the old voices singing carols off-key, the worn photo of Henry tucked into my coat pocket, and I said, I call it justice, and the truest Christmas I have ever known. They say that closing chapters are meant to be quiet, a soft exhale at the end of a lifetime, a gentle fade-out. But in my heart, this was not an end, it was a new beginning. Spring arrived at Second Hearth shyly. The snow melted and gave way to green buds. My roses, planted years ago by my own hands and ignored for seasons, bloomed again. I thought of Henry, thick mittens around my fingers, turning the soil beside me, whispering that memories grow like roots. I understood then that we do not erase the past by forgetting. We cherish it by living forward. Our home had turned into a sanctuary of story, and one day, a filmmaker, drawn by the live stream, when Grandma flips the table, literally, whew, what a title for a beginning, arrived with a camera and a curious heart. She asked if she could document us. I was hesitant. These were women of soft voices, not performers. But we agreed. We agreed because we wanted to show the world that golden years do not dim. They shine in the quiet corners of community and laughter. The film premiered at a local theater in early May. On opening night, I sat in a seat with its back warm and old, and I watched with wide eyes as the screen flickered to life. The camera captured Clara's crooked smile as she described the scarf her father had knitted with too many stitches. Miss Eunice struggled to recall the words of her own story, and then burst into a triumphant laugh when she finally did. Summer rain pattered on the theater's window, and in that shared quiet, we all learned again what it means to belong. Afterward, people lined up to thank me. A young woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "My dad left, Nana," she said. "I thought no one would sit with me. You showed me that someone still will." I hugged her and felt that familiar pulse of remembering and of reclaiming. On my 81st birthday, the women of Second Hearth surprised me with a party. They dressed the dining room with handmade linen and fresh flowers from Clara's garden. There were cards folded with crisp edges and delicate script, lines like, "You are the keeper of every story we thought was lost." I didn't cry. Instead, I stood in the doorway and watched them swirl around me, candles flickering in their laughter. I felt in that moment what it means to be seen. Later that evening, as the moon rose a soft pearl through the window, a letter arrived. It was from Charlie. Her handwriting was shaky. She wrote, "I cannot unmake what I did, but I see now how much you built me from. I want to help. I'm sorry. May I bring Lily for Christmas? I understand now. It's not about presents. It's about honor." I folded the letter and held it close. I replied, "You may come, but not for gifts. Come to remember." I sent it back with a small packet of cinnamon roll dough, half of our tradition, half of a peace offering, and a single handwritten note. "I don't expect regrets. Just return as truth." They came that Christmas. Charlie, Lily, and Jamie. They sat at the big oak table, yes, the same one. They helped unwrap paper strips, laughter weaving around old ornaments, some of which I had rescued from the trash cans after too many modern upgrades. We passed rolls, the smell of cinnamon like a time machine, and for the first time in years, I felt winter isn't cold anymore. In the spring following that Christmas, Second Hearth grew again. A counselor volunteered to host memory workshops. A poet offered to teach writing every Thursday. Every now and then, Lily came back and read to Miss Eunice. When Lily's schoolmates visited for Community Learning Day, they found only warmth. Children on one side of the table, elders on the other, and stories speaking across generations. 2 summers ago, the roses fell heavy with scent. I sat on the porch with a cold glass of lemonade and watched Clara bring a small bouquet to place on Henry's bench. She said softly, "He would be proud of what this place became." And I thought, yes, he would. There are days when I wake before dawn. The house is quiet but for a kettle humming. I pad down the stairs, light a single candle in the parlor, and write in my journal. Not with regret, but with gratitude. I write for the women here, for every grandmother who thought she had nothing left to give. Because stories matter. They said I was a prop. Then I became a lawyer. They said I was forgotten, and I became a haven. They thought the softest voices hold nothing. I prove them wrong every day. So if you ever feel small, if the tables turn cold, come find me at Second Hearth. We keep the lights on. We keep the stories alive. Because the truest legacy isn't in the walls we build or the stones we claim. It's in the voices that echo long after we sit down. That is how we stay. That is how we rise. If this story touched something quiet in you, if it reminded you of a voice you once silenced, or a chair that now sits empty at your table, then let it echo a little longer. Age does not erase worth, it deepens it. And for every woman who's been told to sit quietly in the kitchen, let this be a reminder. Your silence is not the end of your story. It is only the pause before the truth is finally heard. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories if you believe wisdom still matters, and if you want to hear more voices that refused to disappear. Because revenge has no expiration date, and when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.